This video is about proving properties of parallelograms, applying properties of parallelograms, and proving that a quadrilateral is a parallelogram based on a set of conditions. So remember that the properties of parallelograms are that opposite sides are parallel, opposite sides are congruent, opposite angles are congruent, consecutive angles are supplementary, which means they add up to 180, and the diagonals bisect each other. So based on the given information, what else do we need to know to prove that DELZ is a parallelogram? So right now, if they're telling us that E is congruent to Z, they're using the property that opposite angles are congruent. So if we already know those two angles are congruent, the other thing we'd have to know is that D is congruent to angle L. If we know that DE is congruent to LZ, we'd have to know that the other set of sides are congruent. So we would need to know that DZ is congruent to EL. Based on the diagrams, is the quadrilateral a parallelogram? Justify your answer. So in number 3, it tells us that two angles are congruent, but it doesn't tell us about anything else. So in this case, this would not be a parallelogram because we don't have two sets of congruent angles. So we would say no, because two sets of opposite angles are not congruent. We can't guess if they're congruent or not, so we're just going to leave it alone and say that we don't know if they're going to be congruent. Number 4, we have these circles that show that DZ is congruent to EL, and we have the tick marks that show DE is congruent to ZL, which means we have two sets of opposite sides that are congruent, so this is a parallelogram. So we would say yes, because two sets of opposite sides are congruent. Draw and label the parallelogram and then solve for x. So remember to be careful when we're labeling our parallelogram. So if I have a parallelogram part, I need to go clockwise or counterclockwise to label. So I'm going to say A or P A R T. And then I'm going to label what they give me. So they give me that the angle P is 7x minus 10, and that angle T is 2x plus 10. So these angles are next to each other, which means that they are consecutive angles. And remember that consecutive angles are supplementary. So to solve for x, we need to add them together and set it equal to 180. So we have 7x minus 10 plus 2x plus 10 equals 180. So when I combine like terms, I get 9x equals 180. I divide, I get x is 20. In number 6, I again need to be careful when I draw my picture. So I have parallelogram CONE. So I know that CO is 2x plus 7, ON is 3x minus 1, and NE is 23. Remember that your opposite sides are congruent, so to solve for x, we want to use the 2x plus 7 and the 23. So we have 2x plus 7 equals 23. We're going to subtract 7 from both sides, so we get that 2x equals 16, and we divide, we get x is 8. So first in these problems, we need to decide, is this a parallelogram based on what's labeled? And then we can solve for x. So in this case, we have S is congruent to A and N is congruent to W, which means our opposite angles are congruent. So this is a parallelogram because two sets of opposite angles are congruent. So now to solve for x, because it's a parallelogram, we know that our opposite sides are also congruent. So we're going to use x squared plus 3x and negative 5x plus 20. So we get x squared plus 3x equals negative 5x plus 20. So I'm going to move everything to the x squared side. So I get x squared plus 8x minus 20 equals 0. So now I need to factor, I need two numbers that multiply to negative 20 and add to 8. So I have x plus 10 and x minus 2 equals 0. So when I switch my signs, x is negative 10 and x is 2. Now, in this case, when I look at my shape, I know that negative 10 does not work because if I was to put negative 10 into this bottom side, I would get a negative side length. So we only have x equals 2. Number 8. This is one extra special property that allows parallelograms to be a parallelogram. So if we have one set of sides that is both parallel and congruent, this means that it's a parallelogram. So we know that MOHR is a parallelogram because one set of sides is both congruent and parallel. So now that that's the case, we can use this to solve for our x and y. So to solve for x, we know that these two angles are consecutive angles, so they have to equal 180. So we have 6x plus 51 plus 4x plus 19 equals 180. So when I combine like terms, I get 10x plus 70 equals 180. Subtract 70 from both sides, so 10x equals 110. When I divide, I get that x is 11. Now that I know x is 11, I can substitute in to angle M. And when I substitute into angle M, 6 times 11 plus 51 gets an angle of 117. So I know that M and H have to be congruent. So 117 is equal to 7y plus 61. So we're going to subtract 61 from both sides. We get 56 equals 7y. We divide, we get y is 8. In number 9, based on the diagram, KATS is a parallelogram because notice that we have two diagonals that are bisected. So we have two diagonals that bisect each other. So now we're going to solve for x, so we know that our opposite sides are congruent. So to solve for x, we have 4.5x minus 18 equals 2.2x plus 9.6. So I'm going to subtract 2.2 from both sides, and I get 2.3x minus 18 equals 9.6. I'm going to add 18 to both sides, so 2.3x equals 27.6. And when we divide by 2.3, we get x is 12. In number 10, I have 3 of my angles right now. Remember, because it's a 4-side figure, they all equal 360 degrees. So I can subtract the angle measures I know already and get that the missing angle is 50. This helps show that my opposite angles are congruent. So I have 2 sets of opposite angles congruent, so it's a parallelogram. So it's a parallelogram because 2 sets of opposite angles are congruent. So now I'm going to solve for x and y. So remember that my opposite sides are congruent. So I have 3x plus 6y equals 42. And I have 4x minus y equals 11. So because there's an x and y in both equations, I need to use elimination. So I'm going to multiply the second equation by 6. So I get 3x plus 6y equals 42. And I get 24x minus 6y equals 66. So when I add straight down, I get 27x equals 108. And when I divide by 27, I get x is 4. Once you know x is 4, we need to substitute back in. So I'm going to pick the second equation. So 4 times 4 minus y equals 11. 16 minus y equals 11. Negative y equals negative 5. So when we divide, y is 5. So our ordered pair would be 4, 5.